The market opened at the same time it always did, before the sun cleared the ridge, before the wind changed. The vendors came down from the upper settlements carrying what they had: grain wrapped in broad leaves, cloth dyed the color of dark earth, bone tools worn smooth from hands that had used them for years before deciding to sell them. Children ran between the stalls, not because anyone told them to, not because there was somewhere to go, but because the space between the stalls was exactly the right width for running. And no one had told them yet that mornings like this one did not last. Above the market, on the Izvoshra ridge, a young Kaleesh warrior was already running. His name was Chimen Jai Shilal. He was 19 years old, or close enough that the difference meant nothing. The ridge path was loose rock in the upper section and packed clay in the lower. He knew both. He had known both since before he was old enough to run them without falling. His feet moved without instruction, left of the third stone, wide on the turn, short astride, where the path narrowed near the crest. The wind hit him at the top. Salt. Cold. Something burning far up the coast that he hadn't been able to name in 4 days. He stood at the crest and breathed. Below him, the valley, the market, his mother's canopy, ochre, left pole leaning because he had repaired it 2 seasons ago, and not perfectly. The grain vendor, the children. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the sea. The water was in Vorshal, the turning tide. The moment between one moon's pull and the others are when the sea briefly doesn't know which direction to move. The old understanding said this was a moment of attention. The water was listening. He watched it. Then he turned and ran back down. He passed the stone marker without slowing. Dark stone, smooth, set at a slight angle into the earth near the upper switchback, the way something is set when it is meant to stay. He had passed it 10,000 times. He did not think about it. He was the finest warrior his village had produced in 2 generations. The elders had said this formally, at the ceremony where young warriors were assessed. He had stood in the correct posture and received the assessment with the outward stillness that the ceremony required. On the inside, he felt the weight of it, not pride, something heavier than pride. Pride is light. Pride lifts. This was the opposite. The feeling of something placed on you that you did not request and cannot put down. His village's survival, its ability to answer violence with enough violence that the answer meant something. The Huck raids that came with the dry season, the families that had left the valley in the years before he was born, quietly on ordinary mornings because the conditions had stopped sustaining them. All of it rested on him more than on any other person in the valley. He had not asked for this. He had simply become it. He reached the bottom of the ridge and slowed. His breathing steadied quickly. Years of this. The body learns. The morning had brightened while he ran. The light had shifted from grey to the clean gold of full Kaleesh morning. Small insects moved in slow columns above the lower grass, the kind that appear when the tide turns, every time, without fail, as regular as the tide itself. He could hear the market now, the rhythmic back and forth of negotiation. Something heavy set down on a wooden surface, a child crying for a reason that was clearly not serious. You could hear the difference. Every adult in earshot heard it without thinking. The body just knew. He stood at the edge of the path and looked down at the valley. His mother's canopy, the grain vendor, the children running. He stood there a moment longer than was necessary. Then he went down. The rain on Kamino fell the way it always fell. It was not the rain of songs. It did not carry mood. It fell because Kamino's ocean pulled water into the sky, and the sky returned it continuously. without preference for any particular hour or season. It had been falling this way before the Kaminoans built their platforms above it. It would fall after. A RC-5555 stood at a transparasteel viewport and watched it come down. He had been awake since the 4th training cycle, 19 hours by Republic standard. He was not uncomfortable in any way he had language for. He was standing at the viewport because the viewport was where he had ended up after Nina was removed from the dormitory, and he had not yet decided to move. Nina had been removed between the 3rd and 4th cycles, during equipment maintenance, the 40-minute window when cadets cleaned their gear and prepared for the next block. Nina had failed his 4th assessment that morning. Everyone in the dormitory understood what 4 failures meant, not because anyone had explained it, because the structure of the place made it readable, the way weather is readable before it arrives. When the others came back from the 4th cycle briefing, Nina's bunk was empty. His footlocker was closed. The arrangement he kept his maintenance kit in, a specific order, no protocol required it, just the way his mind organized things, was gone. The dormitory noticed the way a room notices when furniture is removed. Not loudly. The space where Nina had been was now a different kind of space. 5 stood at the viewport and watched the rain. Nina had a habit. While he cleaned his equipment, he hummed. Not a song with words. Not anything recognizable. Just a low, continuous sound that he made without appearing to notice he was making it. The sound of a mind that was somewhere else while the hands worked. It was the kind of thing you don't know you're hearing until it stops. The dormitory was quiet now. The quiet had a specific shape, the shape of the sound that used to fill it. 5s was aware of this shape the way you're aware of a missing tooth with your tongue. Not constantly, but when you turned your attention toward it, it was there. The absence. He pressed 2 fingers against the transparasteel. Cold. The viewport was always cold, even when the environmental systems were running warm. The glass held the temperature of the storm outside. He watched the rain hit the platform's surface far below. It hit and spread and ran toward the edge and fell off into the ocean and became rain again eventually. The cycle had no memory of any individual drop. He stood there. He was not supposed to be awake. The 4th cycle had ended 2 hours ago. Recovery period had begun. 90 minutes of sleep before the 5th cycle started. He knew this. He had not moved from the viewport. His brothers were behind him in the dormitory, most of them sleeping with the quick efficiency of bodies that had been trained to rest on command. A few were awake. He could hear the small sounds of wakefulness, the shift of weight on a bunk, the controlled breathing of someone staring at the ceiling. Nobody spoke. Speaking during recovery period was a deduction. 5s watched the rain. He was thinking about the way Nina hummed. He was thinking about the fact that he could not remember what the sound actually sounded like. He could remember that it existed. He could remember where it sat in the room, low near the floor. Because Nina cleaned his equipment, sitting cross-legged on the dormitory floor, rather than at the work surfaces, which was technically a protocol deviation that nobody had corrected. He could remember the space the sound occupied. But the actual sound, the specific pitch and rhythm of it, was already going. He pressed his forehead against the viewport. The cold went through his skull cleanly. Outside, the rain came down in exactly the way it always came down. He was ARC 5555. That was what his designation said. He had a name. 5s. His brothers had given it to him, the way clone cadets give each other names. Not officially, not with ceremony, just the organic process of people living in close quarters and needing to call each other something that felt like a person and not a number. The name came from his designation. It was not a complicated name. It did not need to be. He was 22 weeks from deployment, 22 weeks from the life he had been made for, the one outside Kamino, outside the rain, outside the transparisteel, and the training cycles and the dormitory that now had one fewer person in it. He had been told in the orientation sessions that the Kaminoan administrators ran during the early training weeks that the purpose of his existence was service, that the Republic needed him, that he and his brothers were an answer to a problem that the galaxy had. He had listened to this carefully. He believed it in the way you believe things that you have been given no alternative framework for. Which is to say, he believed it, and also it sat in him the way certain things sit, not settled, not unsettled, just present, waiting for more information. He watched the rain. He thought about Nina. He thought about the sound that was gone now. He thought about how many weeks until deployment. He did not think about what deployment would actually mean, because that was a direction his mind could go, but had learned not to go too far in. Not because he was afraid, but because the information available to him was insufficient for the thought to go anywhere useful. And his mind preferred thoughts that went somewhere. 22 weeks. He pressed his fingers to the cold glass again. On Kaleesh, Kumain moved through the market. The grain vendor called to him by name. He stopped. He bought a small portion of grain he did not particularly need, because the vendor's family had been selling grain in this market for 40 years, and something about stopping to buy felt like the right thing to do without him being able to explain why. He carried it in his left hand and walked between the stalls. The smell of the market was specific: dry grain, cloth dye, the particular animal warmth of people gathered in close proximity in the open air. And underneath all of it, the salt that was always underneath everything on Kaleesh, because the sea was never far. A child ran past him, nearly collided with his legs, corrected, kept running. He watched the child go. Around him the market moved in its ordinary rhythms. Voices. The sound of objects changing hands. Somewhere nearby, a baby in a carrying cloth, asleep against someone's back. She's swaying with the person's movement. He walked through all of it, slowly. He had run the ridge. He had stood at the crest and felt the wind. He had looked at the market from above and then come down into it. This was an ordinary morning. He had had thousands of ordinary mornings. He did not know this one was different from them. That is the nature of the last ordinary morning. It does not announce itself. It arrives wearing the same face as all the others. You move through it, making the same small decisions. Stop at the grain vendor, walk the stalls, feel the morning on your skin, and it lets you. It gives you the full experience of normalcy. It does not warn you. He stopped at the edge of the market, where the stalls gave way to the open path back up toward the ridge settlements. He looked up at the ridge. The stone marker was visible from here if you knew where to look, dark against the lighter rock around it, slightly angled, present. He looked at it for a moment. Then an elder called his name from across the market. The tone was not urgent. It was the tone of someone who needs a word before the day gets any further along. He went. On Kamino, the 5th training cycle began. The dormitory's lighting shifted from recovery dim to full operational. A transition that took 4 seconds and that Fives had timed at some point during an earlier week, out of the kind of aimless precision that hands-on people apply to things that don't need measuring. 4 seconds. Every morning. Without variation. His brothers rose from their bunks with the trained efficiency of bodies that knew the schedule in muscle and bone. Fives stepped back from the viewport. He put his hands down. He turned toward the dormitory. Nina's bunk was still empty. Made, the standard arrangement, as if no one had ever slept in it and no one was expected to. Fives looked at it for 1 second. Then he moved to his own bunk, retrieved his equipment, and began preparing for the 5th cycle. Around him, his brothers moved in parallel, the sounds of equipment and preparation filling the space where the humming used to be. Nobody mentioned Nina. This was also protocol. Not written protocol. Just the understood protocol of a place where people disappeared quietly, and the ones who remained understood, on some level, that the continued fact of their own presence depended on not making the disappearance into a larger event than it was allowed to be. If Fives checked his equipment in the correct sequence, he checked it well. He was very good at being what this place had made him, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat on him the way gifts sit on people who did not ask for them, as responsibility, not pride. The morning tide on Kali turned fully by the time Kamino finished speaking with the elder. The elder's name was Makvor. He was the oldest person in the settlement, and had been the oldest person in the settlement for so long that younger people had stopped thinking of him as old and started thinking of him simply as permanent. One of the features of the place, like the ridge and the stone marker and the twice daily tides. He told Chimayan what the scouts had reported. Hook movement in the eastern pass. 3 days out, maybe 4. Not a raiding party. The numbers were larger than a raiding party. The scouts weren't certain what it was. They had come back with the count and not much else. Chimayan listened. He asked 2 questions. Makvor answered both. Then Chimayan looked toward the eastern pass, which was not visible from where they stood, but which he knew precisely, had run its edges during training, knew its approach angles and its cover, and its 3 points where a defensive line could hold if the numbers were right. The morning was bright and gold around them. The market continued behind them. A child laughed at something. Chimayan said, "I'll go look myself." Makvor nodded. That was the conversation. No ceremony. No weight added to it from outside. It was a practical exchange about a practical problem that had occurred before and would occur again. They had handled this before. They would handle it this time. This time would not stop. Neither of them knew that yet. He gathered his weapons and left the valley while the market was still running. He took the path that curved north before climbing east, the longer route that kept him below the ridge's visible horizon in case anyone in the pass was watching the high ground. His body moved through this automatically. The calculation of visibility and approach was as natural to him as the market sounds and the tide schedule and the name of every stone on the Asvoshra path. He passed the marker 1 more time on his way out of the valley. He did not look at it. He was thinking about the eastern pass, about cover, about numbers, about what 3 days gave them and what it didn't. The stones sat in the earth behind him, dark and smooth and slightly angled, as the morning tide finished its turn and the sea below the valley began its slow pull in the other direction. The 5th training cycle on Kamino was combat simulation. Fives moved through it with the clean, decisive efficiency that had put him in the top percentile of his cohort for 11 consecutive assessment periods. His instructors did not comment on this anymore. There was nothing left to instruct. They watched him run the simulation and mark the scores and moved on. He ran the sim in 47 seconds. The previous record was 51. Nobody in the observation bay said anything. The score appeared on the assessment board. It was logged. It would appear in his file. His file would travel with him to deployment and would mean something to the officers who received him. He stood in the center of the simulation floor after it was over. His breathing was even. His equipment was undamaged. He had completed every objective and not taken a single simulated hit. He stood there while the next cadet took the floor. He was thinking about Nina. He was thinking about the humming. He was thinking about how the dormitory would be calibrated to optimal capacity within 2 days. The empty bunk reassigned, the footlocker cleared. The space where Nina had been redistributed into the facility's general function without remainder. The simulation reset behind him. The next cadet ran. Outside the viewport, the rain fell in exactly the way it always fell. On Kaleesh, by the time Chimain reached the eastern pass, the morning was fully gone. The sun had crossed the midpoint. The wind had shifted. Afternoon wind came from the south on Kaleesh, off the inner continent, dry and carrying the smell of the red clay of the inland plains. He crouched at the pass entrance and looked at the ground. Tracks. Recent. The scouts had been right about the numbers. He stayed crouched for a moment, reading what the ground was telling him. How many? How fast? What direction the weight had been distributed, which told you something about what they were carrying. They were carrying things. This was not a raiding party. He stood up slowly. He looked east along the pass toward the horizon, which was empty. Just rock and dust and the late afternoon light making long shadows of everything. He stood there for a while longer than he needed to. Then he turned and walked back toward the valley, faster than he had come out. That night on Kamino, after the 6th cycle and the evening assessment and the maintenance period and recovery protocol, Fives lay in his bunk and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of the dormitory was a specific shade of grey-white. He had looked at it many times. He knew the exact location of the joined seam between the 2nd and 3rd ceiling panel, offset slightly from center, the kind of small imprecision that existed in every manufactured structure if you looked closely enough. He looked at the joined seam. The dormitory breathed around him. 17 brothers in various stages of sleep. The environmental system's low hum. The rain outside, continuous, exactly itself. Nina's bunk had been reassigned. A cadet from the cycle below theirs had moved into it during the afternoon. The new cadet's equipment was arranged correctly at the work surface, the maintenance kit in the standard configuration, not in the arrangement Nina had used, just the standard one. Fives looked at the ceiling, join. He thought about deployment, about what was outside Kamino, about the war that the orientation sessions had described in the clean, purposeful language of institutions. A war with clear sides and a correct outcome, and a role for him that was well-defined and necessary. He thought about whether he wanted to go. He noticed that the answer was neither yes nor no. It was something that didn't have a clean name. A forward-leaning thing, not enthusiastic, but directed. The war was where the purpose was. The purpose was the only shape his future had ever been given. He would go toward it the way water goes toward the lowest available point. Not wanting, not unwanting, just the direction the structure of things made inevitable. He exhaled slowly. In the dark, in the bunk beside his, someone shifted in their sleep and made a small sound and then was quiet again. He looked at the ceiling. 22 weeks. On Kaleesh, that same night, in the elders' meeting house, Chimain told them what he had found. He described the tracks, the numbers, the direction of weight. He told them what it meant in practical terms, that the Hurk were moving something into the pass, with intent to establish rather than to raid. He told them what that changed about the defensive options available. The elders listened. Makfor asked questions. Chimain answered them. The meeting house smelled of the clay walls and the low fire in the central pit. and the food that had been eaten there earlier. Through the window, the night was clear. 2 moons visible, their light making the ridge pale and distinct against the sky. When the questions were done, there was a silence. Not a frightened silence. The kind that falls when people who have been living with a threat for a long time receive confirmation of something they already knew was coming. The silence of, here it is then. Here is the thing we have been waiting for. Chimain sat with the silence. He looked at the window, at the 2 moons above the ridge, at the faint outline of the stone marker visible against the pale rock, even at night, even from here. A darker shape among dark shapes, slightly angled, present. He looked at it without thinking about it. Then the council began planning. The preparations were calm. They had done this before. Chimayan took his place in the discussion with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were useful for. Outside, the tide had turned again. The 2nd moon was pulling now. The sea below the valley was moving in the night in its enormous, indifferent way. The tides were still right. They would not be right for much longer, but tonight they were. The market in the lower valley opened again the next morning, at the same time it always did. The stone on the ridge was still there. On Kamino, it was still raining. The holofeed arrived in the middle of the 5th training cycle. No announcement, no preparation. The screens in Training Bay 4 simply switched, mid-drill, mid-motion, from the standard tactical display to a live Republic broadcast. The cadets stopped what they were doing because the screens had never done that before. Nobody told them to stop. They just did. The image was poor quality. Geonosis was far out. The signal had traveled through relay stations that were not built for this volume of simultaneous traffic, and the result was an image that stuttered, compressed, lost resolution at the edges, shapes more than details, motion more than clarity. But you could see enough. An arena, enormous, packed with something that moved in the upper tiers, Geonosians, though Fives did not know that word yet. On the arena floor, 3 figures chained to posts. Around them, creatures moving in the particular way that creatures move when they are hunting and not yet killing. Then the Jedi. They came from the stands. From every direction, simultaneously, it seemed. Green and blue, igniting across the arena, like something that had been waiting to happen. The image stuttered, cut, resumed. More Jedi now, more movement. The creatures responding. The arena floor becoming something that the image quality couldn't fully resolve, but that Fives understood as violence. Then the gunships, clone troopers, rappelling down, moving in the patterns Fives had been running in simulation for months. Left flank cover, advance formation, overlapping fields of fire, moving in those patterns on a real surface, under a real sky, with real consequences for every error. He watched. He did not blink. Around him his brothers were watching too. Some leaned forward. Some stood completely still. One cadet, designation CT-1409, who everyone called Echo because he repeated instructions back after receiving them, a habit that had started as a training behavior and become something more like personality, stood with his arms at his sides and his head slightly tilted, the way he looked when he was processing something and hadn't finished yet. Nobody spoke. The feed looped. The arena again. The Jedi again. The gunships again. The clone troopers moving in patterns Fives recognized, dying in ways he had been trained to avoid. He could see that too, between the signal drops. The troopers who stopped moving. The ones who went down and did not get up and around, whom the battle continued without stopping, because battles do not stop for individual conclusions. He watched the feed loop twice. Instructor Colt came in from the side entrance. He stood at the front of the bay. He waited 2 seconds for the cadets to register his presence and orient toward him. They did. He said, "Geonosis. Today. The Republic has engaged separatist forces on the surface. The engagement is ongoing." He let that sit for a moment. Then, "Your deployment timeline has been accelerated. You will be soldiers sooner than previously scheduled." Silence in the bay. One cadet, Fives did not know his designation, a face from the back rows he had seen at meals but not spoken to, raised his hand. Colt nodded at him. The cadet said, "What are we fighting for?" The question was asked plainly, not with challenge, not with doubt, with the genuine, straightforward interest of someone who wanted to understand the purpose of a thing before committing to it. Colt answered. He gave the correct answer, the one the orientation sessions used. The Republic, constitutional order, the freedom of member systems, the rule of law. He gave it in the clean, purposeful language that the Republic used when explaining itself to people. It needed to move in a particular direction. It was the correct answer. Fives listened to it and then looked back at the screen. The feed was looping again. The gunships coming down. The troopers in formation. The ones who stopped moving. He listened to Colt's answer, and he looked at the screen and the distance between the two things. The language of the answer and the image on the screen was a distance he did not yet have words for. He filed it in the part of himself that was accumulating things without destinations. That night, he stood at the viewport again. Rain. Of course. He stood there and thought about the faces on the screen. Not the Jedi, the troopers, the ones in formation, the ones who went down. They had his face. This was not a metaphor or an abstraction. They had been made from the same template. If you put them in a room together and removed the armor, you would need the behavioral differences and the small self-made markings to tell them apart. Same jaw, same eyes, same architecture of bone beneath the same arrangement of features. He had watched men with his face die on a screen in a training bay, and then listened to an explanation of what they were dying for. He pressed his hand flat against the cold, transparent steel. He was not afraid. He was something else. Something that did not have a name in any of the language he had been given. On Kaleesh, the war had already been going for years. Not the Clone Wars, the Hook War, the other one. The one that would not appear in most Republic histories, except as a footnote explaining how Kaleesh came to be a separatist member, as if membership were the point, as if the years before membership had not been their own complete and weight-bearing thing. The Hook had established themselves in the Eastern Pass. What Kamino had read in the tracks 3 months ago had become infrastructure, a Huck forward position with supply lines running back toward their own territory, positioned for something longer than a raid. The skirmishes since then had been frequent and costly in the particular way that frequent costly things become normalized. You stopped expecting the fighting to stop. You started building your understanding of normal life around its presence. Kamino had been in 14 engagements in 3 months. He did not count them as achievements. He counted them as information. 14 engagements gave you knowledge of how the Huck moved in broken terrain, how they responded to flanking pressure, where their command structure showed its seams under stress. Knowledge was what the counting was for. Rondaroo had told him this. She had told him this 2 years ago, when they were still in the early period of fighting, when the raids were still raids and not yet infrastructure. She had said, "Count because it teaches you, not because it makes you more." He thought about this sometimes, in the pauses between things. He thought about it now, sitting at the edge of the settlement's watchpost in the blue hour before dawn, while the village slept below him and the ridge was quiet and the stone marker was a dark shape against the lighter rock, slightly angled, present. Rondeau was sleeping. This was the time of day he preferred, not because it was peaceful, but because the clarity of it was useful. The world before the day's noise. The things that were actually there, visible in the absence of everything else. He watched the ridge. He listened. The second moon was setting. The rumor reached Kaleesh 6 days after Geonosis. It came through a trader from Ord Mantell, who had stopped at the valley market with dried goods and more information than most traders carried. He was the kind of person who paid attention to what moved through the relay stations and understood that information had value in the outer rim because the outer rim was far from where decisions were made and close to where they landed. He said there was a battle on Geonosis. The Republic sent an army. The elders listened. An army of clones, he said, already made, already trained, 100,000, maybe more. The separatists had droids. It's not over yet. He sold his dried goods and left the next morning. The elders held council that afternoon in the meeting house. Shimen sat in the back. He was not an elder. But no one had ever asked him to leave these meetings, and no one asked now. The discussion was careful. The Kaleesh war had already brought them into contact with separatist-aligned interests, a weapons shipment here, a supply arrangement there. Nothing formal. Nothing that had required a decision at the level of membership. This sounded like something that might require a decision. The confirmation came 2 weeks later. Not through a trader, through an official channel. A transmission from a banking clan administrator named San Hill, routed through a separatist diplomatic relay, addressed to the Council of Kaleesh elders. Formal. Sealed. In basic, with Kaleesh translation attached. The elders read it. Then they read it again. Then Makfor called a full council and the message was read aloud. It said, in the language that official things use when they are trying to sound like generosity, the Confederacy of Independent Systems recognizes the sovereignty of the Kaleesh people and their just struggle against aggression. Membership in the Confederacy would bring with it significant resources, military support, and the protection of the CIS fleet. The Confederacy asks only for the partnership and loyalty of the Kaleesh in return. It was a good letter. It sounded like help. The representatives arrived 4 days after the letter. 3 of them, banking clan officials, not soldiers, dressed in the particular way of people whose power comes from numbers rather than weapons, precisely fitted, expensively plain. They came with a protocol droid for translation and a datapad containing what they called terms of partnership. They sat in the meeting house across from the elders. They spoke for a long time. Kamino sat at the back of the room. He listened. He noticed things. The representatives described what Kaleesh would receive: military support against the Hook, access to CIS supply networks, recognition of Kaleesh territorial claims in the disputed Eastern Territories, a seat at the Separatist Council for a Kaleesh representative. They described all of this in detail. What they did not do was ask. They did not ask what the Kaleesh needed. They did not ask what the Kaleesh understood their situation to be, or what kind of help would actually address it, or what the Kaleesh themselves had tried that had not worked, and why. They did not ask what partnership meant in Kaleesh culture, what obligations it carried, what it cost on both sides. They described what the Kaleesh would receive. This was a different thing from asking what the Kaleesh needed. Kamino noticed this. He did not say so. He was not the one doing the negotiating. The elders were doing the negotiating. His role was to understand threats and respond to them with his body and his training and his knowledge of how the Huk moved in broken terrain. His role was not to tell the elders what he noticed in the way that diplomats from the banking clan structured their language. He sat at the back of the room and listened and noticed and said nothing. The elders asked careful questions. The representatives gave complete answers. The protocol droid translated smoothly in both directions. At one point, San Hill's image appeared via holotransmission, blue-white and slightly unstable, to speak directly to the council. He spoke about the Republic's aggression, about the right of independent systems to determine their own futures, about the Huk as an instrument of Republic-aligned financial interests. This last part was true. Kamino knew it was true from his own experience of the Huk, from 14 engagements in 3 months, from the supply lines that ran back toward banking clan territories, from the equipment the Huk carried that did not come from Huk manufacturing. It was true. And it was being said by someone who was part of the same financial architecture that had made it true. He sat with this. He said nothing. The transmission cut out mid-sentence. San Hill was speaking. Something about the future of the Outer Rim systems, the promise of a galaxy restructured along fairer lines. And then the signal dropped. Static. Blue-white light replaced by nothing. The meeting house was quiet for a moment. The protocol droid said, "We apologize for the interruption. Signal relay instability is common in this sector. The Chancellor will reconnect shortly." The elders waited. Kamino looked at the empty air where the transmission had been. The shape of it was still there. The space a presence occupies after it leaves. Blue-white nothing. The static resolved into the ambient sound of the room, the fire in the pit, the wind outside, the representatives shifting in their seats with the particular patience of people who had done this many times in many meeting houses on many Outer Rim worlds. The transmission did not reconnect. After 2 minutes, the representatives said they would send a follow-up communication with the remaining points addressed in text. The council thanked them. The meeting house began the slow process of ending. People rising, the fire being reduced, the protocol droid powering to stand by. Kamino stood up from the back of the room. He picked up his weapons from where he had set them beside the wall. He walked out of the meeting house into the night air. The 2 moons were out. The tide was in Kalshek, the beginning tide, the monthly full pull that the Kaleesh considered an auspicious time for decisions. The sea was loud tonight, louder than usual. He could hear it from here. He stood outside the meeting house for a moment. He thought about the representatives and their careful description of what Kaleesh would receive. He thought about what they had not asked. He checked his weapons in the dark by touch. The sequence automatic. Hands knowing the process without requiring instruction from the mind. Everything in order. Everything where it should be. Then he walked toward the watchpost at the edge of the settlement. There was still the Eastern Pass to think about. There was still the Huk. There was always still the Huk. The empty air where the transmission had been was behind him now. The static, the blue-white nothing, the sentence that had been cut off before it finished. He did not look back at it. He walked toward the ridge. The stone marker was there in the dark, above him. He did not look at that either. He had work to do. On Kamino, deployment was moved forward by 11 weeks. The announcement came during morning assessment. Instructor Colt read it from a datapad without editorial comment. 11 weeks forward. Revised training schedule to follow. G equipment assignment would begin in 4 days. Fives stood in formation and heard this and felt the forward-leaning thing inside him sharpen into something more specific. Not eagerness, something colder than eagerness. The shape of his future, which had always been approximate, had just become exact. He looked at the viewport across the bay. Rain. Continuous. Structural. Exactly itself. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he looked forward and waited for the next instruction. The galaxy had changed while everyone was doing something else. On Geonosis, the archive would later show 212 Jedi entered the arena. The exact number who walked out is recorded differently in 3 separate sources. On Kamino, deployment orders were being cut for 1.2 million clone troopers. On Kaleesh, an elders' council was reviewing terms they had not written in a language that was not theirs. Nobody was looking at the full picture. Nobody had the full picture. That is always how it starts. The Hook War did not end. It accumulated. That is the difference between wars that history remembers cleanly and wars that the people inside them live through without clarity. The clean ones have a beginning and a middle and an end that can be written in sequence. The accumulated ones just keep adding weight. Another raid. Another family gone from the valley. Another morning where the Eastern Pass has to be watched before anything else can happen. The Hook War was the accumulated kind. By the time Chimenjai Shilal was 23, he had stopped counting engagements. Not because they had stopped, because the counting had ceased to produce useful information. He knew how the Hook moved, and he knew their command structure and their supply lines, and the 3 tactical errors they repeated across different terrain, because their officers were trained in a system that did not correct for individual initiative. He had learned everything the counting could teach him. What the counting could not teach him was when it would end. It did not end. Rondaru Lej Kumar fought beside him for 4 years before they were anything else to each other. This matters. It matters because the official record, what little of it exists, filtered through separatist propaganda and Republic dismissal and the general galaxy-wide tendency to reduce Kaleesh lives to footnotes, compresses Rondaru into a motivation. A loss. The thing that broke him before the machine finished the breaking. She is assigned a role in his story and given no story of her own. She had a story of her own. She was the better tactician. Kumain was faster, stronger, more precise with a blade than anyone in the valley. These things were real. Rondaru knew they were real and did not pretend otherwise. But she could read a battlefield the way Makvor read tides, not by calculating the variables, but by standing in the presence of the whole situation and letting its logic become visible. She saw things 3 moves ahead that Kumain only saw 2 moves ahead. She told him this once, directly, without softening it. He had stood there and thought about it honestly and said, "Show me." And she had. He learned to listen to her the way you learn to use your less dominant hand. With effort at first, then with gratitude, then without thinking about it. She disagreed with him tactically 7 times across 4 years of fighting together. She was right 5 of those times. The 2 times she was wrong, she said so afterward, clearly, without being asked. He never kept score. She never kept score. They were not in competition. They were trying to survive and keep their people alive, and ego was a cost that the war could not absorb. When they became something else to each other, it happened the way real things happen, without a moment you could point to later, without a decision that felt like a decision at the time. just the slow accumulation of years of standing in the same direction against the same pressure, until the boundary between two people thins into something that is not quite a boundary anymore. She did not ask him to be less than what he was. He did not ask her to be less than what she was. This is rarer than it sounds. She got sick in the 3rd year after they became something else. Not from the war. That is important. Not a wound, not an injury. Nothing that the fighting had done directly. A sickness that started in her lungs and that a Kaleesh healer recognized and named and explained in the careful language of someone delivering information they know is going to cost the person receiving it. Treatable. Off-world. That was the word. Treatable. But the treatment required medicine that was not available on Kaleesh. Medicine that had been available on Kaleesh 7 years ago, before the Huck trade restrictions had systematically closed off Kaleesh access to the off-world medical supply networks, before the banking clan had made it economically preferable to let the supply lines run only in directions that benefited their partners. The medicine existed. It was manufactured in core world facilities. It moved through trade routes that passed close to Kaleesh's sector. It did not reach Kaleesh. Kamino tried every channel available to him. He was not a politician. He was not a diplomat. He was a warrior with a reputation that had by then reached beyond the valley and beyond Kaleesh. The Hook knew his name and used it carefully, and the Kaleesh in the outer settlements spoke it the way people speak names they have attached hope to. He used this reputation to make contact with traders, with outer rim brokers, with anyone who moved goods through the sector. The medicine was there. The networks were there. Getting it to Kaleesh consistently, for in the quantities needed, past the Hook-controlled checkpoints and the banking clan's tariff structures, was a different problem, a structural problem, the kind that cannot be solved by one person's effort or reputation, because it is not an individual problem. It is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. He obtained some. Not enough. Not reliably enough. Rondeau declined slowly. The word slowly is doing heavy work in that sentence, and it deserves to carry it. Slowly means months. It means she continued fighting in the early period. Lighter engagements, shorter distances, resting more between. It means there were good weeks and bad weeks, and a period in the middle where they both allowed themselves to believe the available medicine was working. It was not working. The good weeks ended. The bad weeks began accumulating. She became too ill to fight, then too ill to walk to the watch post, then too ill to move much at all. He sat with her. He sat with her through the days when the sickness had its full weight on her, and she could not do much besides breathe, and occasionally speak and look at the 2 moons through the window of the room where she rested. He sat with her without trying to fix it because there was nothing left to fix. He had run out of channels. He had obtained everything he could obtain. The system had done what it did, and he had done what he could, and those 2 things together had not been enough. He sat with her. He held her hands. His hands were large and scarred from 4 years of combat. The knuckles thickened, the palms carrying the permanent marks of the weapons he trained with daily. When he held her hands, he held them carefully. The way you hold something you know is fragile. Not because it was always fragile, but because it has become fragile, and you have had to learn a different kind of holding. He had a gesture. It was not something he did consciously or could have described if someone asked. When he was about to tell her something true, something he had decided after thinking about it honestly and wanted her to know because she was the person he thought through things toward, he would bring his right hand up and touch the side of her face, not as a caress exactly, more as a way of making contact before the words, as if the thing he was about to say needed to be grounded first. He did this in the last weeks, not with words attached, just the gesture. She understood it. She died on a morning when the tide was in Vorshal, the turning tide, the moment the water was uncertain of its direction. Chimayen was sitting beside her. It was not dramatic. She had been breathing, and then she was not. The room was very quiet. Outside, the second moon was setting. The insects that came with the turning tide were moving in their slow columns above the lower grass. He sat there for a long time after. He did not make a sound. The change in him after was not rage. People who have only seen the machine, who know only General Grievous and work backward to explain him, assume the rage. They need the rage, because rage is a comprehensible engine. Rage explains things. Rage gives the violence a cause that fits inside a story. What actually happened was quieter and more permanent than rage. It was the silence of someone who has stopped expecting things from the future. Not despair, not the dramatic collapse of hope. Something more functional and more dangerous than that. The state of a person who has simply removed future expectation from the calculations they make. He continued fighting the hook. He continued because the hook was still there and his people still needed the fighting done, and he was the one who could do it best. He continued without the thing that had made continuing feel like it was for something. He was very effective in this condition. The Huck noticed the difference, the change in how he fought, the precision that had always been there now stripped of whatever had previously set a boundary on it. He had always been controlled. Now the control had a different quality, less like discipline, more like the absolute steadiness of something that no longer had anything to protect, and therefore nothing to lose by complete commitment to the objective. He was their finest warrior. He was more so now. He could not have told you what it cost him. He no longer had the internal landscape that would have let him take that measurement. The shuttle crash happened 8 months after Rondeau died. He was returning from an engagement in the Northern Pass, a successful one. The Huck line pushed back 3 kilometers, 2 supply depots destroyed, minimal Kaleesh casualties. He was in the shuttle with 4 others. The shuttle had been checked before departure by his own ground crew, people he trusted, people who had maintained his equipment without error for 2 years. The shuttle went down over the ridge. The cause was determined afterward by Kaleesh engineers who examined the wreckage. A specific component failure in the guidance system, not random failure, not wear failure. The kind that happens when a specific part has been specifically altered, subtly, precisely, by someone who understood the system well enough to make the alteration look like ordinary mechanical fatigue. The 4 others on the shuttle did not survive. Chimayen survived, in ways that the Kaleesh healers who reached him first described as not possible. He had injuries that should not have permitted continued breathing. He was breathing, barely, but breathing. Count Dooku arranged the crash. This is what the recovered records indicate. The reasons are not fully documented. What is clear is that the crash was not an accident, and that it served a purpose, and that the purpose required him to survive it, injured enough to need the kind of intervention that only one facility could provide. The record does not explain why Dooku needed him damaged. The record does not need to. The logic of it becomes visible later. He was transported, while still breathing, to Geonosis. The facility was underground. Cool air, specific smell, antiseptic over something metallic. The smell of manufacturing processes running continuously in adjacent chambers. Lighting that was functional rather than comfortable. The sound of equipment that did not stop. He was conscious for parts of it, not all of it. He was conscious when Sandhill came to speak with him. Sandhill explained the situation with the particular patience of someone describing terms they expect to be accepted. His injuries were severe. Kaleesh medicine could not address them at the required level. What could address them was here, in this facility, which had capabilities beyond what standard medical technology offered. The capabilities involved reconstruction. Sandhill described what this meant. He used careful language. He described function, what the reconstructed form would be capable of. He described purpose, the role that such a being could play in the coming conflict. He described the Kaleesh people and their struggle, and the Confederacy's commitment to their cause. He did not describe what would be lost. Kamino listened. He was lying in something that held him without quite being a bed. A medical support frame, the edges of it visible at the corners of his vision. He could feel his body in the specific way. You feel a body that has been severely damaged, not as a continuous self, but as a report of systems, some working, some not, some absent from the report entirely. He thought about the Eastern Pass. He thought about the Hook supply lines. He thought about his people in the valley. He thought about Ronderoo. He said, yes. The surgical frame closed. This is the sentence the official record gives it. One sentence. The surgical frame closed. What followed was weeks, longer than Sandhill had implied, longer than the facility's technicians had initially projected, because what they were building was not a repair, but a replacement. And replacement at this scale, this completeness, required time that the impatient do not budget for. Kumain Jai Shilal went into the frame. What came out was something that the Geonosian engineers measured and certified, and the banking clan administrators designated, and the separatist military command assigned a rank. It stood. It moved. It was faster than what had gone in, stronger, capable of things that organic bodies are not capable of. 4 arms, the capacity to hold 4 weapons simultaneously, reflexes that outpaced anything biological, a chassis built from the most durable materials the facility's manufacturing processes could produce. Inside the chassis, a Kaleesh cardiovascular system, organic lungs, the brain that had processed 14 engagements and learned from every one of them, the eyes that had watched the tides from the ridge above the valley market, the eyes that had last seen Ronderoo's hands in the light of 2 moons. The engineers noted in their report, subject exhibits full motor function, weapons integration nominal, cognitive performance within projected parameters, emotional baseline. And here the report used a word that translated approximately as reduced, not absent. Reduced, as if the reconstruction had turned down the volume on something without fully silencing it. This was logged as acceptable. This was, in fact, the point. His hands. Before the surgery, his hands had a specific quality of movement when he was with Ronderoo. Large hands, scarred, carrying the permanent marks of the weapons he had trained with since before he could run the ridge without falling. When he held her hands, he held them carefully, because she had become fragile, and he had learned a different kind of holding. And the gesture, the right hand coming up to touch the side of her face before he said something true, not a caress, a grounding, making contact with the person he was speaking toward before the words came. The 4 hands that replaced them could do things those hands could not. They could hold 4 blades simultaneously. They could exert pressure far beyond what organic musculature could sustain. They could move with a precision that no biological hand could replicate. They could not make that gesture. Not because the memory was gone. The memory was still there, in the brain that the facility had preserved, in the eyes that had seen it and would recognize it if they ever had reason to look for it. But the gesture required a particular quality of touch, the particular warmth and weight and slight imprecision of a living hand on a living face. The thing that made contact before the words. The thing that said, I am here and I am about to tell you something true. And I need you to know that. 4 mechanical hands. None of them capable of that. The machine stood in the facility and was examined and certified. Outside, the Geonosian sun moved across a sky that was not Kaleesh's sky. The tides were not right here. There were no tides here. The first thing Fives noticed about deployment was the smell. Not battle, not yet. Just the smell of a military transport leaving Kamino's atmosphere. Recycled air, metal, the particular industrial warmth of a vessel that had been running continuously for longer than it had been serviced. 48,000 clone troopers moving through the galaxy on ships that smelled like this. He stood at a viewport and watched Kamino shrink behind them and thought, I have never smelled anything else. That was true. He had never smelled rain that was not Kamino rain. Never smelled soil. Never smelled a city or a market, or the salt of an ocean that was not the one he had grown up looking at through transparasteel. The viewport showed him open space now. Stars. The hyperspace tunnel beginning to form at the edges. He had seen images of other places. The training hollows had shown him planets, terrain types, climate variations, the tactical implications of different environments. He knew what a forest looked like from a strategic standpoint. He did not know what one smelled like. He filed this in the category of things he would find out. Echo was assigned to the same unit. This was not surprising. They had trained together, tested together, been assessed together for 11 consecutive periods. The Republic's deployment algorithm sorted by performance clusters. They performed at similar levels in most categories, differently in the ones that mattered for specialization, and the result was that they ended up in the same place they had started, beside each other. Echo's real designation was CT-210408. Nobody used it. The name had come from the habit. Early in training, when instructors gave orders, Echo repeated them back, not as confirmation exactly, not the standard acknowledgement protocol, but a full restatement, as if the act of saying the order aloud in his own voice was part of how he processed it. The instructors had corrected this twice in the first training block, and then stopped correcting it because the repetition was always accurate, and the cadets who heard it performed better on the subsequent execution. So the correction was working against the outcome it was meant to produce. The name stuck. Fives had never asked Echo why he did it. He understood, without asking, that Echo didn't fully know either. It was just what his mind did. The order arrived, and the mind needed to hold it in language before it could fully act on it, and the way it held it was by saying it out loud. Some minds worked that way. Echo's did. What Fives valued about this, what he would have said if someone had asked, which nobody did, was that it meant Echo was always actually thinking about what he was being told to do. Most of his brothers executed orders well. They were trained to execute orders well. The training was excellent. The execution was reliable. Echo executed orders well and also wanted to understand them. This was a different thing. He asked questions, not the questions that got you reprimanded, not challenge, not insubordination, not the kind of questions that came from wanting to disobey. The questions that came from wanting to understand. Why this route and not the Eastern approach? What the objective was at the strategic level, not just the tactical one. What happened after, to the position they were taking, to the civilians in the contested zone, to the supply line they were cutting. These questions got him reprimanded twice. The first time, a senior instructor told him, "Your job is the objective in front of you. Strategic context is above your operational level." Echo said, "Understood." He said it in the flat, genuine way that meant he had heard the instruction and was filing it. Not resentfully, just filing it. He kept asking questions. The second reprimand was from a field officer, early deployment, after an operation on Tybrin that had gone correctly by every measurable standard, and that Echo had nonetheless asked 3 questions about in the debrief. The officer was not unkind. He was simply clear. Your function is execution. Questions at this level slow the process. Echo said, "Understood." He continued asking questions to Fives instead, in the bunk after lights down, in the quiet of transport between deployments. Fives answered the ones he knew and said, "I don't know," for the ones he didn't, which was more of them than he would have preferred. What are we holding this position for after we take it? I don't know. What happens to the people who were living in that zone? I don't know. Does the Republic know we're here, or just that the 501st is here? I don't know what the difference is. The difference is whether they know us or just know the unit. I still don't know. Fives found these conversations the most useful part of any day they happened. Not because they produced answers, and because they were the only part of the day that required him to think about what things meant rather than what to do about them. He was very good at what to do about things. He was less practiced at what they meant. Echo was practicing both simultaneously, always, and the practice had no ceiling that Fives could see. He started the record after the 3rd deployment. Not a decision, exactly. More like a response to a specific moment. They had come off a contested position on Felucia. 3 days of fighting in terrain that the training hollows had shown him as green and dense, and that turned out to be all of that, and also hot in a way that the hollows had not conveyed. Hot and wet and full of things that moved at the edges of vision that were not separatist droids, but that your body responded to as if they were. 3 days. They had held the position. 11 brothers had not come back from it. In the debrief, the officer read the casualty count. 11. Just the number. 11. The debrief moved to the next item. Fives sat in the debrief and heard the number and looked at the officer and understood, clearly and without drama, that the 11 were already gone from the record in the way that mattered, reduced to a count, a statistic, a data point in the operational summary that would travel up the chain and become part of a larger number that a Republic military administrator on Coruscant would read and process and file. That night, he sat on his bunk and opened the small personal file that every clone was permitted on their armor's internal system. The file with no official function. The one the Kaminoans included, because the research had shown it marginally improved psychological stability. The one that was technically for personal notes, and was in practice used for almost nothing, because most troopers didn't have personal notes that needed keeping. He typed the first name. He did not type designations. He typed names. The names his brothers had given each other in training bays and barracks and transport holds and the quiet spaces between deployments. The names that the official record did not keep. He typed 11 names. Then he closed the file and lay back in his bunk and looked at the ceiling. He did not tell anyone he had done this. He simply did it. The record grew. Not quickly. Not every deployment added to it. But consistently. The way a river grows, adding from every source it passes through, carrying what it collects forward without losing it. He added names in the dark after operations. He added them on transports. He added them sometimes days after, when a name came back to him that he had not yet written down. A brother from a different unit. Someone he had served beside once and heard about later through the particular informal network that clone troopers maintained across deployments. The way information that the official channels don't carry always finds an unofficial channel. He never looked at the complete record. He only ever opened it to add. He understood, without examining this closely, that looking at the complete record would be a different kind of thing from keeping it. Keeping it was manageable. The complete record, the full accumulated weight of every name, was something he was not ready to hold all at once, so he kept it without looking at it. The file grew. The Citadel happened in the second year. This chapter will not describe the Citadel in detail. It will describe what the Citadel left. Echo went in with the unit. The mission was extraction. A Jedi Master held in a Confederate prison facility on Lola Sayu, a world whose atmosphere made standard approaches impossible, and whose surface made standard everything else nearly as bad. The facility itself was the kind of place built specifically to hold people who should not be holdable, which meant the design of it was intended to defeat the kind of beings who were most capable of defeating design. They went in. Some of them came out. Echo did not come out. Not confirmed dead. This was the specific quality of it. Not a casualty report, not a designation in the killed in action column, not a number in an officer's debrief, just not recovered. Status, unknown. The facility had been compromised during extraction. Some troopers were unaccounted for. Echo was unaccounted for. Five stood in the hangar bay of the cruiser after the extraction and looked at the space where Echo was not standing. He had stood beside that space for 2 years. He did not know what to do with the space now. Unknown was worse than confirmed. Confirmed had weight. Confirmed settled. It was terrible, but it had a surface you could eventually stand on. Unknown had no surface. Unknown was the thing you carried that had no shape, that shifted every time you tried to set it down, that would not become grief. Because grief required certainty, and this was not certain. Maybe he was still in there. Maybe he had found a place to hold. Maybe he was doing what Echo did, thinking about what things meant, asking questions that nobody had answered yet, finding the strategic context of his own survival and working within it. Maybe. Fives carried the maybe like a stone in his armor, not heavy enough to stop movement, present enough that he was always aware of it, a weight that became part of the body's sense of itself, not separate from him, but not part of him in any way that felt right. He did not open the record to add Echo's name, not unknown, not until unknown became something else. He left the space. He noticed things. This had always been true. It was more true now. The noticing had been with him since Kamino. The gap between Colt's answer and the image on the screen. The space where Nina's humming used to be. The distance between what the orientation session said and what deployment looked like from inside it. The noticing had no destination. It was just a function his mind performed, continuously, without permission. He noticed that the official casualty counts in debriefs were always numbers. He noticed that the numbers never had names attached. He noticed that the strategic briefings described clone casualties as acceptable loss ratios, without anyone in the room appearing to find this phrase remarkable. He noticed that the Jedi generals he served under were genuinely trying. This mattered to him. He wanted to be accurate about it, and accuracy required including this. They were trying. Most of them, in the ways available to them, within a structure that had placed them where they were, without asking whether the placement was right. He noticed that the structure did not ask a lot of questions about whether things were right. He noticed that he was noticing all of this, and that the noticing had nowhere to go. He kept the record. He kept doing his job. He was excellent at his job. After the Citadel, he added one name that was not a death. He opened the file on a transport 3 weeks later, in the dark after lights down, and he typed Echo's name with a question mark beside it. He had never done that before. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the file and lay back. The ship around him made the particular sound that ships make when they are moving through space at sustained velocity. A low, structural hum. The sound of everything working together to do one continuous thing. It was not Kamino rain. But if you didn't listen too carefully, if you let the sound come from a distance rather than paying close attention to its specific frequency, it had some of the same quality. Continuous, structural, exactly itself. A sound that existed behind everything else and required no response. He lay in the dark and let the sound be there. He did not sleep for a while. When he slept the way soldiers sleep, quickly, efficiently, in a way that does not much resemble rest, but that the body accepts, because the body is practical and takes what it can get. Beside him, on the narrow shelf above the bunk, the record sat in his armor's internal system. A small thing he had made. It had no official function. It would not travel up any chain. No administrator would read it. No general would cite it. It existed entirely outside the machinery of the war it was documenting. A private record of names that the official record would not keep, kept by one person for reasons that person had never explained to anyone, including himself. It was growing. He did not know how large it would become before it stopped. He did not know that it would not be with him when he died. It was there now. That was enough for now. Somewhere in the galaxy, moving through the same dark between the same stars, a separatist command ship was running its own continuous operations. On it, a being that had once been a man was awake. As it was always awake. As it had been awake without interruption since the surgical frame had closed, moving through its corridors with the particular efficiency of something that did not need to rest, both of them in motion, both of them in the dark, both of them carrying something the official record would not hold. The battle that would define the middle of this story was getting closer. Neither of them knew its name yet. The Battle of Munalinst is recorded in Republic archives as occurring in Senate Month 7, Year 2 of the Clone Wars. In the Kaleesh field, records recovered from a crashed cruiser near Ord Mantell. It is dated to the 3rd day of Malkeen, the month of burning, in the year their god of war first fell silent. They are the same battle. The accounts agree on almost nothing else. The relief unit entered the system 31 hours after the main engagement ended. Fives was not in that unit, but the account that follows belongs to a clone medic designated CT-6116, called Kix because he fixed things, who was and who gave us partial account of what he found to a field officer 3 days later, Jazji, and whose words were preserved not in any official record, but in the informal testimony archive that the 501st kept in the years after the war, when survivors were still trying to describe what they had seen to people who had not seen it. Kix said, "The smell reached us before we landed." He said, "It's not what you expect. You expect burning. There is burning, but underneath it there is something sweeter, something that shouldn't be sweet. That's the part that stays with you." He said, "The droids were still everywhere, not operational, just there. In pieces, mostly, but pieces that still looked like what they had been. An arm here, a torso against a wall, the head of an IG unit staring at the sky with the particular blankness of something that was built without the capacity for expression and that therefore looks the same destroyed as it did functional. You had to keep reminding yourself that these were not people. The shape of them made you keep forgetting. He said, the city was standing. He paused there in the account. He said, that's the thing nobody tells you. The city was standing. The buildings were there. Most of them. You could see where the fighting had moved through. The scorch patterns on the walls, the collapsed sections, the streets where the surface had been torn up by something heavy moving across it. But the buildings were standing, and the lights were off, and there was no sound. He said, a city makes sounds when it's working. You don't notice the sounds until they're gone. Then you notice. Fives heard the account later. On a transport from Kix directly, in the particular informal way that information moved through the 501st. Not in briefings, not in official channels, but in the spaces between deployments where there was nothing to do but talk or not talk. And some days, talking was the only way to confirm that things had actually happened. He listened without interrupting. Kix described the streets, the scorch patterns, the droids, the smell. Then Kix described finding the tablet. He had been moving through a collapsed section of the lower commercial district, checking for survivors, which was the official purpose. Though 31 hours after the main engagement, the probability of survivors in the combat zones was already low and dropping. He was moving carefully through the rubble, the particular careful movement of someone who knows that what they are walking on was recently something else. He found it under a section of collapsed wall, a child's educational tablet, the kind produced by a dozen core world manufacturers and distributed through the Republic Education Network to systems that participated in the standardized curriculum program. Moonalinst, as a banking clan world, had used a slightly different version, Moon Educational Materials, adapted for local curriculum standards. But the form was the same, small, rounded edges, designed to be held by small hands, designed to survive being dropped because children drop things. It had survived considerably more than being dropped. It was cycling through its lessons. The screen was undamaged. The lesson displayed was basic mathematics, the kind taught to young children in the early stages of formal education. Numbers, simple operations, a small animation demonstrating the concept, looping. Kix picked it up. He held it. He stood in the rubble of the lower commercial district of Moonalinst, surrounded by the smell of what the battle had left behind, and he held a child's educational tablet that was cycling through a mathematics lesson because nobody had told it to stop. He held it for a moment. He set it down. He did not say anything in his account about what he felt in that moment. He described what he did, picked it up, held it, set it down, and then he continued describing the streets, the scorch patterns, the ongoing work of moving through a city that was standing and empty and making no sound. Fives listened to all of it. He did not say anything when Kix finished. There was nothing to say that would not make the tablet smaller than it was. Grievous stood at the outer wall of the banking clan facility. What remained of it? The wall had held through most of the engagement. Moonalinst's banking clan architecture was built for permanence. The Moon aesthetic prioritized mass and solidity, structures that communicated stability because stability was the product they were selling. The facility's outer wall was 2 meters thick at the base. It had held. Then it had not held. The section in front of him, had come down during the final Republic push. The Jedi-led assault that had broken the IG Lancer droid cavalry's formation and forced the withdrawal decision. He had watched the wall come down from the command position. He had already made the withdrawal decision before it fell. The wall falling was confirmation of a calculation already completed. The withdrawal was correct. He had done what he came to do. The banking clan's primary secure archive on Munalinst had been extracted before the Republic forces reached the facility. The intelligence value of the engagement exceeded the tactical cost of the withdrawal. By every measurable operational standard, Munalinst was a success. He stood at the collapsed wall and looked at what the engagement had produced. Rubble. The particular arrangement of rubble that comes from structural failure under explosive pressure. Not random, but patterned. The pattern of the forces that had acted on it. Readable if you knew how to read it. He read it. He understood exactly what had happened to every section of this wall. He was aware that this was what he did now. Read destruction and understand it in the technical language of force and structure. He was aware that this was different from what he had done before, reading the same forces in a different language, the language of terrain and bodies and tactical implications. Both readings were accurate. The new one was faster. He turned from the wall. He walked through the rubble of the facility's outer courtyard. The Kaleesh soldiers who had served under him in this engagement were accounted for. Mostly. 3 were not. 1 had been confirmed in the combat data. His transponder had ceased broadcasting during the cavalry engagement, a clean and unambiguous signal. 2 others were unaccounted for, not confirmed, just absent from the recovery. He walked through the courtyard. He was not looking for anything, so he found it anyway. It was caught between 2 sections of fallen wall. A small object, flat, made of carved bone. Kaleesh bone carving was a specific craft, distinct from other outer rim traditions in its use of interior marrow channels as part of the design, rather than just the structural material. The carving on this piece was old, not recent work. The edges had the particular worn smoothness of something handled daily for a long time, a warrior's charm. The kind that Kaleesh soldiers carried, because the tradition said that the charm connected you to the lineage of warriors who had carried similar objects before you. Not magic, not superstition exactly, more like a conversation with continuity. I am in a line of people who have survived difficult things. This object is evidence of the line. He picked it up. He held it in one of his hands. One of the 4 mechanical hands that could exert crushing pressure on durasteel, that could hold 4 lightsabers simultaneously, that could move with a precision no biological hand could match. He held the charm. He was aware that it should mean something. He was uncertain what. He knew whose it was. One of the 2 unaccounted soldiers. He knew from the carving style, a specific regional pattern from the inland settlements of Kaleesh, the red clay territory east of the valley where the Isvoshra Ridge ran. He had learned to read these regional patterns because knowing where his soldiers came from was tactical information. Where they came from told you what they were trained for, what terrain they read instinctively, what conditions they performed best in. It told you other things too. If you were paying attention. The soldier who had carried this charm had been 19 years old. He had joined the Kaleesh forces before Grievous's campaigns had formally integrated with the separatist structure. One of the first wave of soldiers who had followed Grievous not because of the Confederacy, but because of him specifically. Because of what he had been before the frame. Because his name had meant something in the valley, and the meaning had travelled. He was gone now, unaccounted for. which meant either dead in a location the recovery operation hadn't reached, or captured by Republic forces. And capture on a banking clan world in a losing engagement was not a category that produced good outcomes. Grievous held the charm. He was aware that he was doing what the charm was designed to facilitate, connecting to something. A line, a continuity, the people who had carried similar things before. He was uncertain whether the connection was available to him, whether what he was now could access what the charm was pointing toward. He kept it. He did not examine why. He put it in the sealed compartment in his chassis where he kept the lightsabers, the trophies, the collection that everyone who faced him knew about and that nobody had ever fully understood. He put the charm there too. It was not a trophy. He did not have a word for what it was. The moon rose over Munalinst at the same time it always rose. This is the indifferent fact that both sides of this battle share equally. The moon's schedule was not adjusted for what had happened on the surface below it. It rose when its orbital position brought it above the horizon as it had the night before, as it would the night after. It rose over the banking clan facilities' collapsed outer wall, over the lower commercial district where a child's educational tablet was still cycling through its mathematics lesson, in the dark now, screen glowing faintly against the rubble around it, over the streets that were standing and empty and making no sound, over the relief unit's camp at the city's edge, where clone troopers who had spent the day moving through the aftermath were in various stages of rest that was not really rest, the kind of rest that comes after a day of that kind of work, over Kix, who was awake, sitting outside the camp's perimeter, looking at the city, over the separatist withdrawal fleet, already in hyperspace, moving toward the next position, and over the sealed compartment in a command ship's chassis, where a carved bone charm sat beside 7 lightsabers, in the dark, with no light to reflect. The moon rose. The city was quiet in the specific way of a city that has stopped rather than a city that is resting. You could feel the difference if you stood in it. Resting cities make small sounds. The structural settling of buildings, the ambient noise of systems still running, the particular inhabited quality of air that has been breathed and moved through and used. A stopped city was completely still. The air had a different quality, not emptiness, exactly. Something more like suspension, as if the city was waiting for instructions that were not going to come. The moon climbed. It did not know what it was rising over. What it was rising over had happened anyway. The silence after artillery is not peaceful. This is something Kix said in his account at the end, almost as an afterthought. He said, "People who haven't been in it think silence after fighting means it's over. It doesn't mean that. It means the air hasn't decided yet. It means everything that just happened is still in the air and hasn't settled. You can feel the weight of it. It's like the air is holding something it doesn't know how to put down." He said, "It settles, eventually, over days. The air goes back to being air, but for a while, the first hours, sometimes the first day, it's not peaceful. It's pressurized. Like the silence itself is about to say something. It never does. It just sits there, heavy, until the weight becomes normal, the way any weight becomes normal if you carry it long enough. Then the next thing happens, and you carry that too. What follows does not appear in either side's official record of the Clone Wars. It is reconstructed from 3 partial survivor accounts. None of them are official testimony. All of them were found in personal archives after the war ended, in the belongings of people who had kept them quietly, without explanation, the way people keep things they do not know what else to do with. The events are presented as they were described. No conclusion is offered. None of the available evidence supports a conclusion. This chapter has no date. not because the date is unknown, because the date appeared in neither side's official record, and therefore assigning it one, placing it in Senate Month 3, Year 2, or in the third day of Krathvor in the Kaleesh grief calendar, would give it an official existence that both sides specifically chose not to give it. It happened in the third month of the Republic's second full year of active engagement. That is as precise as the record allows. The transport was called the Fortuna Median. This detail all three accounts agree on. The name of the ship. The name is the clearest thing in all three accounts, which is perhaps because names are the first things people learn and the last things they forget, or perhaps simply because it was written on the side of the vessel in large letters, and everyone who saw it read it. The Fortuna Median was a mid-range civilian transport, the kind produced in bulk during the pre-war expansion period, and when Outer Rim trade was growing, and the demand for basic cargo and passenger vessels outpaced the supply of more specialized ships. It was not built for speed or for comfort. It was built for capacity and reliability, for moving a lot of people or a lot of goods from one point to another without mechanical failure. It was flagged as separatist. This meant it was registered in a system that had formerly joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems, one of the hundreds of Outer Rim and Mid-Rim worlds whose membership in the CIS was less a declaration of political allegiance and more a statement of which side of the conflict their trade routes now ran through. The flag was administrative. It determined which naval patrols had jurisdiction and which had the authority to stop and board. It was carrying primarily refugees. The three accounts describe them differently in their specifics. Different estimates of the number, different descriptions of where they were from, different details about their composition. What the three accounts agree on, they were civilian. They were from a contested system, a world that had changed hands twice in the previous 6 months, and that the ongoing fighting had made uninhabitable in the functional sense, the sense of, you cannot grow food here, you cannot get medicine here, you cannot send your children somewhere that is not a combat zone. They were going somewhere else. They had the documentation that refugees from contested systems carried, which is to say, incomplete documentation, because the systems that issue documentation had stopped functioning normally, and the documentation that existed had been issued by administrations that no longer existed in the same form, and the records that would have verified the documentation were in databases on worlds that had been fought over and whose administrative infrastructure had not survived the fighting intact. This is not unusual for refugees from contested systems during wartime. This is, in fact, one of the defining conditions of being a refugee from a contested system during wartime. The Republic Naval Patrol that intercepted the Fortuna Median near the Hydian Way was operating under expanded patrol authorization. All three accounts confirm this without knowing it. None of the three use the phrase expanded patrol authorization, but all three describe behavior consistent with it. The patrol was operating further from its designated sector than standard protocol permitted. It was stopping vessels that standard protocol would have cleared without boarding. It was, in the language that the Republic military used internally during this period, conducting proactive security operations in corridors adjacent to confirmed separatist supply routes. The Hydian Way was one of the galaxy's oldest and most traveled hyperlanes. It ran from the outer rim, through the mid-rim, and into the core. Everything moved through it: goods, people, information, military assets. In wartime, it became a contested artery. Both sides wanted to know what was moving through it. Both sides were watching it. The patrol stopped the Fortuna Median at a position that none of the three accounts can precisely locate, Sure, because none of the three accounts were keeping navigation records. They were passengers. They knew they had been in hyperspace, and then they were not, and then there were Republic ships alongside them. The boarding party arrived 40 minutes after the intercept. Processing. This is the word all three accounts use. Processing. It is a bureaucratic word. It describes a bureaucratic activity, the verification of documentation, the cross-referencing of names against watch lists, the determination of status and category and appropriate disposition. It is the word that administrative systems use for the things they do to people, because the word people implies a different set of considerations than the word cases or subjects or cargo. Processing took 18 hours. During those 18 hours, several hundred people, the three accounts give different numbers, ranging from 340 to 412, were held in the Fortuna Median's primary cargo bay. The cargo bay was not designed for this use. It was designed for cargo. All three accounts describe the same physical conditions. The bay was large enough. The temperature regulation was not calibrated for human or near-human occupation at this density. There was one refresher unit in the adjacent service corridor that the boarding party allowed access to on a rotating schedule that the accounts describe as insufficient. Food was not provided for the first 9 hours. Water was provided twice. The lighting in the cargo bay ran on the ship's emergency circuit rather than the primary system, which meant it was dimmer than standard, like a flat blue-white that made it difficult to judge the passage of time. People waited. Children were present. All three accounts mention children specifically. Not as a rhetorical device, they mention them because they were there, because children in a cargo bay for 18 hours in insufficient temperature with limited water are a logistical and human problem that everyone in the bay was aware of simultaneously. An awareness of a problem that you cannot solve creates a specific kind of collective atmosphere. The accounts describe the atmosphere in the cargo bay using different words. One says tense, one says quiet, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful. One, the most fragmented of the three, uses a miniciat word that does not translate cleanly into basic, but approximates to the feeling of holding your breath for so long that you have forgotten what exhaling feels like. Something happened during the 18th hour. The three accounts differ on what. The first account, kept by a woman whose name is recorded only as an initial in the archive where it was found, describes raised voices from outside the cargo bay. Republic voices speaking in basic too quickly and too quietly for her to understand the words. A period of silence. Then sounds she describes as movement, but not the movement of people walking. Something heavier, more deliberate. Then more silence. Then the cargo bay door opened and a Republic officer told them the processing was complete and they would be returned to the Fortuna Median. She describes the moment of returning to the transport. She describes looking around at the people who came back with her. She describes beginning to count and stopping. She does not say why she stopped. She does not say what number she had reached when she stopped. The second account, found in a sealed file in a refugee processing center on Ord Mantell, attributed to an individual listed only as adult male, Zabrak, Outer Rim, Origin, describes something different. He was near the cargo bay door during the 18th hour. He heard less than she did, and more clearly. He heard one voice, Republic, male, the tone of command, say a number. He heard another voice respond. He heard what he describes as several people being told to come with us, in the flat tone that instructions are given in when they are not expected to be refused. He did not see who was told this. The cargo bay was large. The lighting was the flat blue-white of emergency circuit. He was not near enough to see the door clearly. He heard the tone. He describes the tone in a single sentence. It was the tone you use when you have already decided. The third account is the most damaged. It was found in a personal data pad, recovered from the belongings of someone who did not survive the following year. Not from anything related to this incident, simply from the ordinary attrition of living in a contested system during wartime. Large sections of it are corrupted beyond recovery. What remains describes the cargo bay, the children, the temperature, the waiting. The 18th hour section is partially recoverable. The recoverable portion contains the following. And then there were fewer of us, and nobody explained why. And we did not ask, because asking felt like it would cost something we couldn't afford to spend. The rest of that section is gone. The narrator does not say who gave the order. The accounts do not agree. The first account does not describe an order at all, only its aftermath. The second describes a voice and a tone, but not a name, or a rank insignia, or any detail that would identify the person speaking. The third account's relevant section is corrupted. The narrator does not say how many. The accounts do not agree. The numbers given in each account are different and cannot be reconciled with each other or with any external record, because no external record exists against which to reconcile them. The Fortuna Median's passenger manifest was filed with the Transport Authority of its origin system. That system changed hands twice in the following 4 months. The manifest is not recoverable. The narrator does not say what happened to them. The accounts don't know. The first account knows only that they were fewer. The second account knows only the tone of a voice making a decision. The third account knows only that something cost something, and that asking felt dangerous. This is what the 3 accounts agree on. The Fortuna Median was released after 18 hours. The people who came off it were fewer than the people who had been loaded into the cargo bay. The Republic Naval Patrol's official log for that patrol date contains no entry for an intercept near the Hydian Way. The entry for that period reads, routine patrol, no contacts. Just sector clear. The Separatist Intelligence Service's records of that transport corridor contain no entry for the Fortuna Median. This is less surprising. The SIS's records of civilian transport movement in that corridor are incomplete for the entire 3rd month of Year 2, for reasons the records themselves do not explain. Both sides' official records contain nothing. The 3 accounts contain what they contain. The Fortuna Median arrived at its destination 4 days later. The refugees who arrived said very little about the journey, not nothing. People who have experienced something will sometimes speak around it, will describe the conditions, the duration, the logistics, in the way that people describe the edges of something, when they cannot describe the center. Some of them describe the cargo bay, the temperature, the children, the waiting. Some of them described the moment the door opened and they were told the processing was complete. None of them, in any account found in any archive from this period, described the 18th hour directly. The ones who did not arrive said nothing at all. The record moved on. The patrol continued its operations. The Hydian Way remained a contested artery. The war continued accumulating. Another engagement here. Another system changing hands there. Another set of numbers in a debrief that moved up the chain and became part of a larger number that a Republic military administrator on Coruscant filed and did not examine. The war did not stop to account for the Fortuna Median. It had not stopped for anything else. It did not stop for this. The debriefing room on Coruscant had no windows. This was standard. Debriefing rooms were not designed for comfort or for the psychological benefit of natural light. They were designed for focus, for the reduction of external variables, so that the information being extracted could be extracted cleanly, without the interference of weather or traffic, or the particular quality of Coruscant's perpetual city glow that came through windows and reminded people that they were somewhere specific rather than nowhere in particular. The room had a table, 2 chairs, a recording unit set into the wall at eye level, its indicator light a steady green, a pitcher of water that nobody had touched. Fives sat on one side of the table. The man across from him had a title that was longer than it needed to be: Director of Special Operations Intelligence, Coruscant Sector, Clone Army Oversight Division. Fives had been given the title in writing before the session began. He had read it and understood that the length of the title was doing work, that it was meant to establish something about the seriousness and the authority of what was about to happen. He had noted this. He had sat down. The mission had gone complicated on its 3rd day. This chapter will not describe the mission in detail. The mission is not the point. What the mission produced in Fives, in the days after, in the particular quality of attention he brought to this debriefing room, is the point. What the mission produced was a specific kind of knowledge, not strategic knowledge, not tactical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from being in a place where something is happening that does not match the briefing you received before you went there, and from being intelligent enough to understand the gap, and from having no channel through which the gap can be officially reported, because the gap involves things that the official channels are not designed to receive. He had filed his standard after-action report. He had been called to this room 4 days later. The director asked questions for 40 minutes. Fives answered them. The questions were thorough. They covered the mission's timeline, the engagement specifics, the decisions made at each stage, the outcomes relative to objectives. They were the questions that a competent debrief should contain. They were not the questions that should have followed from what Fives had actually reported. His after-action report had contained 3 items that did not appear in the standard template, items he had added in the supplementary notes section, which existed for exactly this purpose: the recording of observations that fell outside the structured categories. The items were specific. They described things he had seen and heard in the contested zone that did not correspond to the intelligence picture he had been given before the mission. Discrepancies, not minor ones. The director did not ask about them, not directly, not indirectly, not in the 40 minutes of thorough, competent questioning that covered every other aspect of the mission with precision. Fives waited. He answered each question completely and accurately. He did not volunteer the supplementary items. He was waiting to be asked. This was not stubbornness. It was a test that he had not announced, and that the director was not aware of taking. At the 38th minute, the director reviewed his notes, appeared satisfied, and indicated that the session was nearly complete. Fives said, "You didn't ask about the supplementary items." The director looked up. He said, "Those items are being reviewed separately by the appropriate analytical division." Fives said, "Which division?" The director said, "That information is above your operational clearance level." Fives said, "Understood." He said it in the flat, genuine way that meant he had heard the instruction and was filing it, not the way Echo used to say it. Echo's understanding had always carried a quality of actual engagement, of a mind that was going to keep thinking about the thing even after acknowledging the instruction. This was a different kind of understanding, the kind that files the information in a specific category and does not expect the category to be addressed. The director completed the session. He thanked Fives for his service. He used the word service in the particular way that people use it when they mean, you have completed a transaction and the transaction is now closed. Fives walked out of the debriefing room and into the corridor. The corridor was the kind of corridor that existed throughout the Republic's administrative infrastructure on Coruscant, wide enough for two people to pass without difficulty, lit with the efficient overhead panels that gave everything a clean and slightly flattening quality. The walls, the particular shade of grey that communicated institutional seriousness without communicating anything else. He walked. The corridor looked the same as it always had. He had walked corridors like this one on a dozen Republic facilities across the galaxy. He had never thought about them. They were functional spaces. You moved through them to get to the functional space where the actual thing was happening. He walked through this one and thought about the questions that had not been asked. Not with anger. Not with the drama of betrayal. With the particular quality of attention that his mind applied to things when the pattern was incomplete, and the incompleteness was informative. The supplementary items had not been asked about. This was data. The reason given for not asking about them, being reviewed separately, was a reason that raised more questions than it answered, which was data too. The director's manner when Fives had raised the omission, the slight adjustment in posture, the choice of phrasing, the specific word clearance, was data. He was accumulating data that had nowhere to go. He had been accumulating it since Kamino, since Colt's answer and the image on the screen, since the debrief where 11 dead brothers became a number and the number moved to the next agenda item. The accumulation had no destination. He walked. The corridor felt, for the first time, like something built for purposes that were not his purposes. The width of it, the lighting, the grey that communicated seriousness. These had always been neutral to him. Background, infrastructure, and the environment that the work happened inside. Now they felt intentional in a way that was different from before, not threatening, just designed, built to specifications that someone had decided on, specifications that he had never been shown and had not been asked to approve. He turned toward the barracks. He did his job. The Separatist Council chamber was large enough to suggest importance. This was also intentional. The chamber on Raxus, the CIS's nominal capital, the seat of its governmental identity, was designed to communicate that what happened here mattered, that the decisions made in this room carried weight proportional to the room's dimensions and the formality of its arrangement. The long table, the flags of member systems arranged in the prescribed order, the lighting that fell from above in a way that made everyone seated at the table look serious and illuminated and significant. Grievous stood at the back. He was permitted to attend council sessions when the agenda included items classified as military strategy. He was not permitted to speak during the formal session. He was permitted to respond to direct questions. The distinction had been explained to him once, early in his tenure as Supreme Commander, by a protocol officer whose manner suggested he found the explanation distasteful but necessary. Grievous had said nothing in response. He had attended every session since then and stood at the back and listened. Today the agenda included the Kaleesh Nebula corridor and 3 contested mid-rim systems. San Hill spoke first, as San Hill generally did. He had a quality of voice that was designed for rooms like this. Measured, authoritative, the tone of someone who was accustomed to having his analysis treated as the final analysis, because the financial resources behind him made other analyses optional. He described the 3 contested systems in terms of strategic value. The strategic value he described was expressed in credits, not literally. He did not say, This system is worth X credits and therefore worth fighting for. He used the language of strategic importance, of supply chain integrity, of resource access and corridor control. But the underlying calculation was financial, and Grievous, who was a genuine military mind and therefore a genuine strategic thinker, could translate the language in both directions. He listened. Wat Tambor spoke next. His words came through his translator apparatus, in the particular mechanical cadence that made everything he said sound like it was being read from a document rather than thought of in the moment. He described production capacity. He described manufacturing timelines. He described what the three systems could produce if the CIS secured them, and what they could not produce if the Republic held them. Grievous listened. Poggle, the Lesser, communicated through his own translator, his Geonosian gestures precise and economical. His contribution focused on construction timelines for the contested positions. He was the most honest of them, Grievous had concluded over time. Not because he was more principled, but because he was more literal. He did not dress the manufacturing concerns in the language of liberation. He simply described manufacturing concerns. Then Newt Gunray spoke. Newt Gunray was describing the third system. The third system was a mid-rim world called Siskeen. It had a name that meant nothing in most languages, but that meant something specific in the operational records that Grievous carried, in the parts of his memory that had been enhanced beyond the biological baseline. Siskeen was a world that had changed hands 7 months ago, in an engagement that had cost the Kaleesh soldiers under his command 43 dead and 11 critical casualties. He had taken Siskeen in 11 days of surface fighting in terrain that required the particular skills that Kaleesh warriors had and that battle droids did not. He had taken it at a cost that he had considered acceptable given the strategic value of the corridor. Gunray was describing the corridor now. He was describing it in terms of the Trade Federation's shipping interests. He was describing the tariff implications of CIS control versus Republic control. He was describing the impact on the Trade Federation's core to outer rim shipping margins. He was describing, with the particular detail that people apply to things they genuinely care about, what secured control of this corridor would mean for the profitability of trade routes that the Trade Federation had been running at reduced margin since the war began. He did not mention Siskeen. He mentioned the corridor 17 times. He did not mention the 43 dead. This was not new information. Grievous had understood for a long time what the Council was. He had understood it in the way that a strategic mind understands things, not through emotional revelation, but through the accumulation of observable data that points consistently in one direction. The Council's decisions tracked commercial interests with a consistency that could not be coincidental. The systems chosen for major offensive operations correlated with banking clan holdings and Trade Federation routes at a rate that pure strategic logic did not explain. The resources allocated to engagements changed in ways that aligned with quarterly financial reporting cycles. He had known this. He had continued. He had continued because the alternative, stopping, withdrawing from the war, returning the Supreme Commander's designation to the Council, and walking away, was not an alternative that was available to him. Not because they would have stopped him, because stopping required a direction to walk toward, and there was no direction. Kaleesh had already been promised things that were contingent on his continued service. The soldiers who had followed him from Kaleesh were already committed. The war had its own momentum now, and he was part of that momentum in a way that could not be cleanly separated. He had continued. Today, something was different. It was the way Gunray said the number. not the number of dead. Gunray did not say the number of dead. He said a different number, the projected increase in Trade Federation shipping margin, expressed as a percentage that would result from secured control of the Siskine corridor. He said it with satisfaction. The satisfaction was not performed. It was genuine. The genuine satisfaction of a being who has spent his professional life working towards specific numerical outcomes and has just described one that is favorable. The number pleased him. He said it the way people say numbers that please them. Grievous stood at the back of the room. He thought about Siskine. He thought about the 11 days of surface fighting. He thought about the terrain, which was the kind of broken mid-latitude terrain that Kaleesh warriors read instinctively and that he had trained them to use. He thought about the 43 dead and the 11 critical casualties and the specific names that he had not logged anywhere. He did not keep a record the way Fives kept a record, but he carried names in the parts of his memory that had been preserved, the biological parts, due to the parts that the frame had not replaced. Because names of Kaleesh warriors who had followed him specifically were a category that his mind held onto without being instructed to. He thought about Gunray's number. He thought about the gap between the number and the names. The gap was not new. Today it settled differently. It became something that sat in him in a different position than it had sat before. Lower, heavier, more permanent. Not rage, not grief. Something colder than both. The specific temperature of a thing that has been true for a long time finally becoming undeniable. He said nothing. He stood at the back of the room and said nothing, and let the council continue. The session ended. A protocol officer approached him and indicated that the tactical briefing was ready in the adjacent room. This was the transition that always followed the council session. The formal business concluded. Now the military business. Now the part where his role was not observer but participant. He followed the protocol officer out of the chamber. He did not look back at the council table, at Sand Hill reviewing financial projections, at Gunray still speaking to Tambor about margins. He walked into the adjacent room. He received the tactical briefing. He issued orders in a voice that the officers around him read as confidence. This was accurate in the technical sense. The voice was steady, precise, authoritative. It communicated command. The officers around him responded to it the way they always responded to it. What the voice did not communicate was what was happening at the level below the voice. The orders were correct. He had reviewed the tactical situation, and the orders were correct. This was not in question. His military competence had not changed. The thing that had changed was underneath the competence, in the part of him that the frame had left organic, in the part that carried names. He issued the orders. He boarded his command ship. In a room on Coruscant that did not appear on any Senate map, a man sat at a desk and read 2 reports. One was from an agent embedded in the Republic's Special Operations Intelligence Division. One was from an agent embedded in the Separatist Council's administrative staff. The man read both reports with the particular quality of attention that people bring to things they find deeply satisfying, not rushed, not impatient. The attention of someone who has been working toward a specific outcome for a very long time and is watching it develop on schedule. The reports described, from 2 different angles, the same state of affairs. Both sides were exactly where they needed to be. He set the reports aside. He had other appointments. The war was proceeding correctly. Fives reached his barracks. He sat on his bunk. He did not open the record. He did not add a name. There was no name to add today. No death. No loss. No brother gone from the roster. Just a debriefing room and a set of questions that had not been asked, and a corridor that had felt, for the first time, like it was built for someone else's purposes. He sat. He thought about what he was part of. He did not have a complete answer. He had never had a complete answer. He had observations that pointed in directions he could not fully see the end of, and a record of names that had no official function, and a set of skills that were exceptional and that had been given to him before he existed, and that he used every day in service of something whose full shape he could not see from where he stood. He sat with this. He did not stop. He would not stop. Not because he had resolved the question of what he was part of, because stopping required a different kind of answer than the one he had. And the one he had was, there are brothers still in the field, and the field still needs what he was built to do. He lay back on his bunk. The ship's hum moved through the walls. He stared at the ceiling. The question sat in the room with him without answering itself. He did not ask it to. The chip was small. This was the first thing Fives had thought when he understood what it was. Not, what does this mean? Not, what do I do with this? Just the physical fact of it. The size of something that had been inside every clone since before they took their first breath, installed with the precision of people who understood that the most effective controls are the ones that cannot be felt, small enough that you would not know it was there, small enough that the Kaminoans had described it in the documentation that existed for it as a behavioral modification implant for the prevention of aggression in clone units, a safety measure, routine. The documentation used the word routine 3 times in 4 sentences, which was 2 times more than routine things needed to be described as routine. He had found it by accident. The finding is not the point of this chapter. The point is what came after the finding. The days of running down every channel available to him, of taking the information to the people who had the authority to do something with it, of watching those people either fail to understand or choose not to understand, which produced the same outcome from where he was standing. He had gone to the Jedi. He had gone to Shakti, who had listened with genuine attention, and then been given information that contradicted his, and had chosen, reasonably, to trust the information from the source with more institutional authority. He did not blame her for this. He understood how institutions worked. He had been inside one his entire life. He had gone to Rex. Rex had listened. Rex had heard him. Rex was the person in this story who came closest to understanding what Fives was carrying, and even Rex could not carry enough of it fast enough to change what was coming. He was running out of time. He could feel it the way you feel weather, not with specific knowledge, but with the body's accumulated experience of what certain conditions produce. The attention around him had changed quality, the way people looked at him, the slight difference in how orders were relayed, the fact that he had been called to Coruscant at all, which was irregular, which had reasons attached to it that the reasons given did not fully explain. He knew what irregular felt like. He had been filing irregular things for years. He had 3 days. He did not know he had 3 days. He knew he had some amount of time that was less than he needed, and more than nothing, and that the amount was decreasing, and that decreasing amounts of time had a specific quality of pressure that he had learned to recognize from the field. The feeling of an operational window closing, the body's automatic shift into a mode that prioritized essential actions over everything else. He moved through Coruscant with this feeling in him. Coruscant was not a place he had spent much time. His deployments had taken him to a dozen worlds, but rarely to the capital, and the capital had a specific quality that other worlds did not. The sense of being inside the machine rather than adjacent to it. On other worlds, even Republic worlds, You could feel the distance between the place you were standing and the place where decisions were made. Gion Coruscant, there was no distance. The place where decisions were made was everywhere. The Senate building, the Jedi Temple, the administrative towers that processed the information that determined what happened on all the other worlds, the corridors that connected them. He walked through those corridors. He carried what he knew in the only container available to him, himself. He had no official channel for it. He had tried the channels. The channels had produced the outcome of channels that are not designed to receive what you are putting into them. They had routed the information somewhere that was not the right place and indicated that the correct process was being followed and that he should return to his unit. He had not returned to his unit. He kept going. He was not afraid. This requires saying clearly, because it would be easy to read these days as fear. They were not fear. Fear has a specific quality, a contracting quality, a pulling back. The body's signal that the correct response to the present situation is retreat or stillness. What Fives had was the opposite of that, a forward quality, a pressure that moved toward rather than away. He did not have a word for it. He had felt it before. In the field, when the situation had deteriorated past the point of the original plan, and the only available option was to continue into the deterioration rather than away from it, because the brothers were still there, and continuing toward them was the only direction that meant anything. He was continuing towards something now. He was not sure what. He was not sure there was anything to reach. He was continuing, because the alternative, stopping, returning to his unit, filing the information in the part of himself where unfiled things lived, and waiting for someone with more authority to eventually find it, was the one thing he could not do. He had Echo's name in the record with a question mark beside it. He had 40-some other names without question marks. He had what he knew about the chip. He kept going. This is the most Kaleesh thing about him. He had never heard of Kaylee. He did not know that there was a word in a language spoken on an outer rim world for the specific quality of a person who continues past the point where continuation makes strategic sense, who continues because stopping would require them to feel the full weight of what has already been lost. And the weight is not something they can afford to feel while there is still something in front of them. He did not know the word. He had the thing. Across the galaxy, on a separatist command ship running dark through a mid-rim transit corridor, a different offer was being made. The emissary was not San Hill directly. San Hill used intermediaries for things that required a quality of personal approach that his own manner could not produce. The intermediary was a separatist military liaison whose name is not relevant. A being of middle rank whose function was to communicate things in the tone that the recipient needed to hear them in, which was the function of all effective intermediaries. The offer was a new command, a campaign in the Outer Rim, the specific details of which were presented as strategic necessity, but which Grievous understood within the first 90 seconds of the briefing as positioning. He was being moved. The campaign would take him away from the core adjacent operations, where he had been most effective, and toward the Outer Rim, where the engagement timelines were longer and the supply lines were thinner, and the political situation was considerably more complex. He listened to the full briefing. He asked 3 questions. The answers to 2 of them confirmed what he already understood. The answer to the third, a question about resource allocation for the Kaleesh soldiers still under his direct command, was the kind of answer that says, that will be addressed through the appropriate channels, which meant that is not the priority, and you know it is not the priority, and we are both going to continue as if the appropriate channels are a real thing that will address it. He said nothing to this. He had been saying nothing to versions of this for 2 years. He understood the offer completely. He understood that he was being moved because his effectiveness in core-adjacent operations had become a variable that the Council's financial partners were finding difficult to optimize around. He understood that the Outer Rim campaign would extend indefinitely, because Outer Rim campaigns always extended indefinitely, because the Outer Rim was large and the supply lines were thin, and the political complexity produced conditions that sustained engagement without producing resolution. He understood that indefinite extension served specific interests, and that those interests were represented at the council table, and that the 43 dead on Siskeen and the names he carried in his biological memory were not represented at the council table, and never had been. He understood all of this. He accepted the command. He did so clearly, without performance, in the same voice he used for tactical briefings, the voice that communicated command and precision and the particular authority of someone who has been doing this long enough that doubt does not appear in the voice even when it exists below it. The liaison thanked him, used a word that meant something like, "The Confederacy values your service." Grievous heard the word service in the particular way that word lands when you have heard it applied to you enough times to understand what it actually means. He accepted the command anyway, because the alternative was stillness. This is the thing that both of them share. In this chapter, in these days that are running in parallel on opposite sides of the same war. Not the tactical situation, not the specific nature of what each of them knows or does not know. The thing underneath all of that. The alternative was stillness, stopping, acknowledging the full shape of what had been lost and what was continuing to be lost and what was going to be lost regardless of anything either of them did. Sitting with that acknowledgement, letting it be the thing that determined what came next. Neither of them could do it, and not because they were incapable of stillness in general, because this specific stillness, the stillness of full acknowledgement, would have required them to feel the complete weight of everything they were carrying all at once. And the complete weight was not something that could be survived in a single moment. It could only be survived in increments, in the daily practice of continuing, in the forward motion that kept the weight distributed across time rather than accumulated in one place. They continued, both of them, for reasons that were not the same as the reasons they had started with. Fives had started with purpose, the clean, given purpose of a being made for a function. He continued now with something that had no given name, something that was closer to refusal than to purpose. The refusal to let what he knew disappear into silence without having been said aloud to someone who could hear it. Grievous had started with his people, the specific, concrete people of the valley under the ridge, and then the broader people of Kaleesh, and then the broader project of resistance that the Confederacy had offered a language for. He continued now with something that was closer to inertia than to purpose. The specific inertia of a being who has removed future expectation from its calculations, and therefore has no reason to stop that outweighs the reason to continue. Both of them made a free decision. Both of them made it inside a machine that had decided their direction before they arrived. The corridor on Coruscant was empty at that hour, maintenance hour. The administrative traffic had stopped. The cleaning droids had passed through 40 minutes ago and would not return until the next cycle. The overhead panels were dimmed to the night setting. Not dark, never fully dark in the Republic's facilities, but reduced, the light having a different quality than during the operational hours. Flatter, more final. Fives stood in the corridor. He was not going anywhere specific. He had been going somewhere specific and had stopped here without deciding to stop. The way you sometimes stop in a place because the place has a quality of privacy that the next place will not have. And there is something you need to do that requires privacy. He stood still. He began to say names, not loudly, not with performance. In the quiet voice of someone doing something they have always done alone and intend to keep doing alone. He said them in the order he had added them to the record, not alphabetically, not by unit, but in the order of loss, which was the order that his memory had organized them in, because the mind files grief chronologically, whether you ask it to or not. He said them all. It took a long time. He stood in the dimmed corridor and said every name in the record, and then stood quietly for a moment in the space after the last one. Then he walked on. In his quarters on the command ship, Grievous stood before the rack. The lightsabers were arranged in an order that no one else knew the logic of. He knew it. He had placed each one himself in a sequence that was not random, but that he had never explained, and that the crew had learned not to ask about. 12 sabers now, different colors, different designs. The variations in hilt construction that reflected the individual who had built it. The choices made by a specific hand for a specific grip. The small personalizations that made each one not just a weapon, but an object that had belonged to someone particular. He ran one hand along the rack, not picking them up, just the contact. The particular weight and temperature of each hilt under his mechanical hand, which could not feel warmth, but could register pressure and texture with more precision than a biological hand. A precision that was different from feeling, but that produced information about the objects he was touching. He stopped at one. He did not take it from the rack. He stood with his hand resting on it. He was aware that he did not fully understand why he did this. He had never analyzed it directly. He had a strategic mind that applied analytical precision to most things, and this was the one thing he had left unanalyzed. Perhaps because he understood, below the level of analysis, that analyzing it would produce an answer he was not prepared to receive. He kept the collection. He came here alone and ran his hand along it. This was as close as the machine could come to the gesture. The right hand raised, contact made before the words, the grounding before the truth. He had 4 hands that could do things no organic hands could do. None of them could make the gesture. This was what he had instead. He stood there for a while. Neither witnessed, neither announced. 2 private rituals on opposite sides of a war, performed by 2 people who were both, in their different ways, trying to carry the dead forward with them. They would not carry them much further. But tonight they were still carrying. Tonight the names were still being said. Tonight the hand was still moving along the rack. Tonight was still tonight.